Well, g'day and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm your host, Ross Coulthart, and today we've got something special, an aviation mystery, possibly one of the world's greatest aviation mysteries. No, it's not MH370 disappearing into the deep beyond. It's something better than that. It's the story of aviatrix Amelia Earhart. And to help us here today is a guy called Jeff Garcia. Jeff's a television executive and systems designer working across unscripted content and complex data-driven projects. He's an investigative researcher who specialises in detailed analysis of often fragmented material in TV. Jeff's developed and executive produced series for platforms including Netflix, Amazon, Nat Geo, and Discovery. Over the past few months, Jeff's been applying that skill set to the recently declassified Earhart archives, notably the archives recording what was pumped as the most thorough investigation ever in aviation history. He's focused especially on that search that's revealed in the now declassified archival documents. What he's uncovered is, I believe, quite shocking. The public's been told for 88 years that a very thorough search was done of all the nearby islands near where Earhart and her navigator were last tracked. Unfortunately, as Jeff will reveal today, his analysis suggests that the search was far more limited than the official narrative suggests. Jeff, welcome to Reality Check, sir. It's great to have you here.
Hello, Ross. How's it going?
Good, mate. Good. So listen, let me give a quick backgrounder to the whole Amelia Earhart story for a lot of people who don't know who she was. Amelia Mary Earhart was an American aviation trailblazer, author, and advocate for women's opportunities in a male-dominated field, aviation. She was born in Atchison, Kansas. She became the 16th woman to earn an international pilot's license in 1923. Her record-setting feats included being the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1932, for which she earned the Distinguished Flying Cross before it became a military-only award. She got this through special legislation. She was the first person to fly solo from Honolulu to Oakland across the Pacific in 1935, and she won numerous speed and distance records for women. She promoted commercial aviation and founded the 99s organisation that works for female pilots. She was married to the publisher George Putnam, and she used her fame and money to challenge gender norms while pursuing increasingly ambitious flights. By 1937, at the age of 39, she was attempting to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe along an equatorial route. And for her final flight, 88 years ago, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were on the second and final attempt of a planned 29,000-mile around-the-world flight in a twin-engined Lockheed Model 10E Electra aircraft. After departing Oakland, California on the 30th of May 1937, they had successfully flown eastward through South America, Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. God help them, they were nearly home. The most challenging leg was the 2,556-mile over-water crossing from Lae in Papua New Guinea, which was then the territory of New Guinea, to tiny Howland Island in the Central Pacific, a US territory that was selected as a refueling stop because of its strategic location. The flight required precise celestial navigation and radio navigation aids, complicated by the plane's heavy fuel load. There were reported instrument issues earlier in the trip, and the island was also very small, only about 1.5 miles long, a tiny speck in the middle of the Pacific that she had to navigate to with dead reckoning. They departed Lae at 10 a.m. local time on July the 2nd, 1937, with only enough fuel for roughly 20 to 24 hours of flight. Earhart and Noonan vanished on July the 2nd, 1937, somewhere over the central Pacific Ocean. Their last confirmed radio transmissions were received by the US Coast Guard cutter Itasca, stationed near Howland Island. At approximately 8:43 a.m. Howland time, Earhart reported, "We are on the line 157337. We are running on line north and south." She indicated they were low on fuel and unable to locate the island visually or via radio direction finding. No further verified signals from the plane were received. The official presumption is that the Lockheed Electra ran out of fuel and ditched at sea somewhere in the vicinity of Howland Island. Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were declared dead in absentia on January the 5th, 1939. So it's a very grim story, Jeff, and it's one that I think has intrigued people for many, many years, partly because she was probably at the time one of the world's most famous women. What intrigued you about the story?
Well, I have to say, I've always been attracted to mysteries, and this is one of the great ones of modern history. I have, always followed the case and always wondered about it. Growing up, I was raised being told stories of treasure hunting from my grandpa. So this really, really intrigued me. And it felt like a great case to put forth my, reasoning of what I've been able to do, and that's taking a bunch of messy data and making sense of it. And that's exactly what I've done here.
So let's go through the basic facts of what we know. Can you explain what she meant when she said, "We are on the line 157337, we are running on line north and south"?
So that's called the sun line. It's a line of positioning. It's not coordinates. She's basically saying what you would typically do in that day and age is if you can't find your target, what you're going for, you would typically run the line. So then that takes you either north or south. So therefore, she must have been going one of those two directions.
So 157 is a compass bearing, is that correct?
That would be sort of southeast. So it's just a line of positioning. Yeah, or north, the 337.
So essentially, it's an arc. It's an arc of compass bearing measurements.
Exactly.
So you've got 157 on one side and 337 on the other. They're somewhere in that arc. What size of ocean is represented within that arc?
It's out in the middle, the Pacific, out in the middle of nowhere. So if you would go north, running the line north, there is just open ocean. There's nothing for a while. If you run it south, then you have the Phoenix Island group, and there's a bunch of atolls down in that direction, which would be the only thing in that area.
Right. And we know a fair bit about the search because US government records are now housed at the government archives, the National Archives, and they document what's been described as one of the largest air-sea searches in world history up to that point, July 2nd to 19th of 1937. The US Coast Guard cutter Itasca conducted an initial search around Howland Island, and the US Navy expanded the effort, deploying an entire battleship, the USS Colorado, with 3 observation float planes. There was a seaplane tender, the USS Swan. There were other vessels, and the searchers covered thousands of square miles centred on Howland Island and nearby Baker Island. They used visual reconnaissance, radio direction finding, surface patrols, and there's an official 96-page Navy report entitled Report of Earhart Search by US Navy and US Coast Guard. It's declassified now, fully publicly available. It concluded the plane most likely ditched at sea after fuel exhaustion, with no wreckage or survivors located. The search was called off on July 19th, 17 days after her disappearance. There were exhaustive but fruitless efforts to find her. Was the search as thorough as has been represented by the US Navy, Jeff Garcia?
It was not, and that's the interesting thing about it. The narrative for nearly 90 years has been thorough search. When that indeed, if you look at those declassified records, anyone could go find them themselves and do the same work. They're there for everyone. It contradicts itself. You can't have a thorough search yet, put all your efforts around one location. That just doesn't make sense.
Okay, so what do you think went wrong?
Well, I could only point to the record, and what the record would indicate is when they asked for extra support, they basically told them, we can't give you that support. We just don't have it available. We would need a bigger ship to do that, which wasn't available at the time. So right there, that wouldn't be, to get the support they needed to go to the Phoenix Island chains in that area.
Your thesis is that she, in fact, went down near or on the Phoenix Islands, Nikumaroro. Is that correct?
Nikumaroro. Well, I mean, I could only speak to what the record says. So, I mean, you would think, just using common sense, if she's running the sun line, and common sense would tell you they would have to know that there's just open ocean north. There's nothing to be found. So likely, if they were using a map, they would notice that there's islands. They probably knew if you go take the sun line south. So therefore, that would be a good target to thoroughly search or do a grid search of the Phoenix Island chain, which never happened. And that is in the record. They actually called off in the logs. They called off the search to go that direction and focused all their effort around Howland Island because they thought it was a plane that went down in the water and was a possible rescue mission from the plane or from them floating in the water.
Okay, so let's talk about the island in question, Nikumaroro, formerly Gardner Island. The island is interesting because allegedly skeletal remains were found there in 1940. Nikumaroro is a remote, uninhabited coral atoll in the Phoenix Islands group that's part of the Republic of Kiribati in the Central Pacific. Formerly known as Gardner Island under British colonial administration, it's a small, low-lying atoll about 4.5 miles long with a central lagoon, a fringing reef and dense vegetation. And it lies about halfway between Australia and Hawaii. It's part of the Phoenix Islands protected area. Now, we know that in 1940, a British colonial officer, Gerald Gallagher, so this is 3 years after she disappeared, discovered partial human skeletal remains, including a skull, jawbone, and other bones on the southeast end of Nikumaroro during a survey. He noted associated artifacts, a campfire with animal bones, a sextant box, and perhaps most intriguingly of all, remnants of a woman's shoe and a man's shoe, suggesting castaways who'd lived there temporarily. The bones were sent to Fiji for analysis, where a doctor initially concluded they were those of a short, stocky European male, but unfortunately those remains were later lost. In 2017, 2018, forensic anthropologists re-examined the original measurements and determined that the bone lengths were statistically more consistent with a white female of Northern European ancestry, matching Earhart's height, about 5'8", than it was with 99% of other reference populations. This has fueled the hypothesis that Earhart and or Noonan survived a landing on the reef, became castaways, and tragically perished on the island. It's unproven. There's no DNA, no definitive identification exists. It's a core pillar, though, of what's called the Nikumaroro hypothesis, alongside other artifacts. There's been aircraft aluminium found, plexiglass, and possibly a freckle cream jar, which might have been Earhart's. Do you believe that those remnants were Earhart and or perhaps her navigator?
I mean, I can't say for sure. I mean, I can't speak to that. I will only speak to what the record says, and that hasn't been proven yet, to my knowledge.
Okay, so Nikumaroro is about 350 to 400 nautical miles southeast of Howland Island. So, by golly, if she did end up on Nikumaroro, it's a huge deviation from where she said she was headed. Talk me through how that could possibly have happened. I still don't quite understand why flying the sunline, as you've described, would lead her to go southeast without at least saying that's what she was doing on her radio.
Well, yeah. So the other important thing that happened was there was a communication systems failure. So she could hear Itasca speaking. Other way around. She was speaking to Itasca, and they could hear her. She could not hear them. Okay, so that's a key point too, which I'm sure likely drove up her stress. So all they know from her is that she said running low on gas and taking the sun line. So as I said before, if you take the sun line south, which let's just say likely she could have, because that made more sense than taking it north, then that would take you into the Phoenix Island, chain or group, which Nikumaroro, or at the time called Gardner Island, was a part of. So that's why there has been multiple expeditions to that island searching for her, because it makes sense. And not to mention in the logs, you could see from the logs, which were, I think, played down, over the more general narrative throughout history, that there was, you could take it for whatever you want, but there was flashes of lights. There was radio signals, multiple flashes of lights that came, that could have been flares.
You're saying there were flashes of lights from Nikumaroro?
From that area south of Howland, where the other boats and rescue mission was taking place. So much so that they, turned to go to that direction. This is on the logs, to inspect, and then turn back around. But yeah, multiple logs.
So why did they turn back around? Why didn't they go to the Phoenix Islands and do an exhaustive search?
They just dismissed it. Likely a operational lock-in, where they decided it made most sense that she went down around Howland, and they didn't have the resources to search in an area where they thought, it was low probability where she was at. But if you look back at the record, I would say, it would be a more higher probability that is an area that I would have thoroughly searched, as the record claims.
Okay, there was an aerial search. One of those float planes from the battleship, I understand, was deployed, and they did do quite an extensive aerial search from height over the islands. Surely to God, if she was alive, she would have come out and waved and indicated that she was there and in need of rescue.
So there wasn't a thorough search of those island chains and of that area. Nikumaroro, Gardner at the time, they did one flyover of that island. That's it. And I would not call that thorough whatsoever. There was no grid search done, and it's really difficult at that altitude to see what may have been a crash or a person, if it was indeed on that island, or any island for that matter. It was one single flyover. That's it. I wouldn't call that a thorough search by any means.
So the key quotes, I was reading the official report, and there's Rear Admiral Orrin Murfin, who was the commandant of the 14th Naval District. In his report dated the 31st of July 1937 that was submitted to the Chief of Naval Operations on the full report of the Earhart search by the US Navy and Coast Guard, he wrote, "It's regrettably unreasonable to conclude, other than that, the unfortunate flyers were not above water on conclusion of the search." Do you agree with that statement?
I don't think you could say that. Again, I think that's what happened, is that's what they believed, and that's what they likely locked into. So they put all the resources around around Howland Island, thinking it was a rescue mission, but not putting those same resources into the Phoenix Island, group.
So then the next quote I found was Captain J.S. Dowell, who was the commander of USS Lexington's search group. And in his 20th of July 1937 report on the Lexington aircraft group, he stated, "Except for the comparatively small areas that were blanked out by rain squalls, the search was thorough, and it is the conviction of the aviators who did the flying that neither the Earhart plane nor the survivors were in the area searched." So this is probably the most direct official affirmation of supposed thoroughness in the search. The Lexington group alone conducted extensive aerial sweeps covering 151,556 square miles in some summaries, west and northwest of Howland Island. But that assertion of thoroughness then means the Lexington didn't cover the area you're talking about.
No, I mean, and that's a huge contradiction of what I found when I, put it into my system and it flags contradictions. You can't have both. Right? You can't do as they, another quote is thorough search operations of Pacific islands and atolls. You can't do that while, I'll read you another direct quote from the logs. The decision to search the quadrant southeast from Howland and the Phoenix Islands. However, by elimination of this quadrant, the Lexington group was later enabled to execute a more practicable and more extensive search of the western semicircle from Howland. So they're basically saying we dismissed searching an area, that made sense. It did make sense, but we're going to go and focus all our efforts around Howland because we think that, that's likely where she went down.
So there's a key third quote that I wanted to put to you, which is Captain Wilhelm Friedel, F-R-I-E-D-E-L-L. He was the commanding officer of the USS Colorado. And on the 7th of July, 1937, that's 5 days after she disappeared, Friedel reported, "We will have made a thorough search of the northern Phoenix group, that includes Nikumaroro Island, by Friday." And this referred specifically to aerial searches of Gardner/Nikumaroro Island and nearby islands by Colorado's float planes. Essentially, it was the Colorado that conducted the first on-scene island inspections. So I'm sure the US Navy would say they did do a very thorough inspection of those islands. What do you say to that?
I don't think that's the case. And also from the same logs, they said they did 2 flybys, which I would hardly say that is by any means thorough. And when, in the same logs, when they were, asked for support to search that area, they said that they didn't have the support to do a real search of the area. So, again, there's contradictions where thorough search, but we don't have the support to give you to search that area. Thorough search, but we're pulling our resources from actually going and searching that area and putting our focus around Howland. How could 2 be true?
What do you believe should have been done to make an assertion that they did make, that they'd done a thorough search of the Phoenix Islands group?
I mean, you would have probably taken a grid search, the same sort of support and focus that they put around Howland with actual ships, not just one flyover from a plane. I mean, that would, do it a lot more, justice. So all I'm saying is, if the record doesn't support that, then, what actually, what maybe we need to rethink about the whole investigation and about what likely happened.
So let's go through what is new in what you've found. Obviously, some of the Earhart archives have been declassified before 2025, but there was a big declassification last year, 2025, from the National Archives that, because of an order made by President Trump, it essentially ordered all of the Earhart files finally to be disclosed. Firstly, why hadn't they been disclosed in the first place? I mean, this is something that happened 88 years ago. What basis was there for any continuing lack of transparency on the search for the Earhart plane? What do those records show? What were the revelations that you found in those records that haven't been picked up yet?
Well, I think some things have been discussed, but I would, say I don't know why they weren't released, but I don't think people, have had the time to actually go through it line by line, in thousands and thousands of pages and see the exact contradictions of the logs. One big one that we haven't talked about or discussed yet is, very interesting and possibly one could maybe say that it altered the search. Is there's two contradicting logs. One saying from Earhart, low on gas, and then there's another log saying, half running out of gas, only 1/2 hour left. Two completely different logs. So which one is it? The more known later narrative was running out of gas, 1/2 hour left, which that possibly it could say a lot and take you one way or the other. Where I'm running low on gas, what does that mean? Or I only have 1/2 hour left of gas, and maybe that's why they focus an area that would cover 1/2 hour around Howland of flight time.
Okay, so you think that the search was constrained to largely the area west and northwest of Howland Island based on an assumption that she only had 1/2 hour of fuel left?
It's quite possible. It's very possible. Why else? I don't know for sure. I don't know what they were thinking, but the record does say they focused everything around Howland. So, why did they believe that? Possibly because they didn't think she had that much gas left, and she had to bail and crash around Howland.
Right. So what are the other contradictions? You've highlighted that there are things in the logs. One of the things you've talked about earlier was the suggestion that it was requested, that there was a request made for the search to be taken to the southeast. Was there a request made? And tell me more as well about these alleged sightings of flares and lights. What did you see in the logs and the files of the search?
Some say horizon, seeming flares.
And they were to the southeast, where Phoenix Islands are?
Yeah. Yes.
Is it plausible that a flare dropped from an aircraft 300 miles away would be seen from Howland Island or from the Itasca, one of the search vessels?
Let me just go back a second. There's multiple records and sightings of flares coming from that, or what they thought was flares coming from that direction, or lights from that direction. And they, even so much so that they, turned around to route towards that direction, south, and then stopped and then came back.
Who turned around?
It's ships that were searching for her around Howland.
So have we been told this before? I mean, is this something new, that ships wanted to go further southeast and search towards the Phoenix Islands group, but they were discouraged from doing so?
I mean, I think that's been in the record. I just don't know if anyone's spoken about that or really explored that more. But you could find some people talking about that and discussing it, but no, I don't really know. If there's been much put into that whatsoever.
Were there any flares or lights seen in any other direction than the southeast towards the Phoenix Islands group?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, I just saw and pulled, reported flares, but a couple different things, and not to mention there was multiple calls of people calling in and saying that they heard, radio, a woman distressed voice speaking over radio as well. That has been spoken about a little bit, but at the same time, the engineers said that in order for her to make a distress call, the plane could not be on water and it had to be on land. So therefore, they dismissed it. The same thing, I'm sure, with maybe flares. It was dismissed.
I don't understand why you would dismiss a call with a woman's voice sounding in distress. Surely if the plane was at altitude and she was using her radio, one could reasonably assume it might be Amelia Earhart.
Exactly. And there was multiple distress calls that happened. I believe as well coming from her call signs, I want to say, as well. But they just chopped it up to, it might be someone else, not her. So, like I said, quite possibly Operation Lock-in.
I don't understand that. Well, I mean, I'm not criticizing you, by the way. I'm trying to understand the US Navy's decision making. Do you think there's any logic to the decision that the US Navy made that because there were people reporting a woman's voice clearly in distress, clearly from an aircraft, what basis did they have for assuming that the aircraft must be on land for her to be able to make the call?
Well, if you lock into something and your assumption is saying she went down around Howland, then everything you hear after that doesn't fit that narrative, might get dismissed, and that's quite possibly what could have happened.
And did the radio calls that you're describing, was it possible to direction find those radio calls and suggest that they perhaps came from the southeast in the direction of the Phoenix Islands group?
Yeah, I don't know at the time if they were able to do that, but I know after the fact, more recently, that has been done where they have triangulated those calls and put them in that area. But that wasn't me that has done that, but I know some groups have been able to do that more recently, which makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, it's funny, Jeff. I've flown to America more times than I care to remember, and I often think as I'm sitting in an aircraft looking out of the window at the big, vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, especially on the route from Sydney to Hawaii, which is a non-stop trip from Sydney. You're just looking at empty ocean for most of the trip, and you actually fly. When you're on the Qantas flights or the United or American Airlines flights, you fly very close to Howland Island and the Phoenix Island group. And I've often been intrigued by the Amelia Earhart story. It was such a raw act of courage back then in the 1930s to try and navigate using, well, you couldn't even use for most of the flight celestial navigation because it was mostly daytime that she was flying. And there was a risk, I guess, that at nighttime she wouldn't have been able to see the stars because of the weather. Is that what confounded, do you believe, her flight? Why did she get lost, do you believe?
I'm not quite sure. There was some weather, I believe, that happened around that time. And, it's not like it is today when you're flying. Navigation wasn't, as precise. It's not like, it's not like instruments and, using tech. So you could, maybe her navigator, Fred, was a little tired. Who knows what happened? And you could easily get put off course, which may have happened. A little tiny bit of air over, as you just said, when you're stretching that much distance of open water, could be, a tiny little air could be a huge problem. And that's may have what happened. I mean, they were close enough that they were able to, get in, radio signals to Itasca. So that says something right there. Because if they weren't close, then they would have never received those. But we just don't know how close and in what direction, because they weren't able to triangulate that.
Yeah. What was the radio range of her aircraft at the time?
It's not precise because there's a whole bunch of different things that could go on. But I've heard things that maybe within, they could lock in if she's within 50 miles of the ship. But outside of that, could have been anywhere within 100 miles where they could get, roughly, I'm speaking about, anywhere maybe within 100 miles to receive, or for her to receive the signal.
Doesn't it make it more plausible then, if it was only 50 to 100 miles range for her radio and they were picking her up on the Itasca, which was near Howland Island, doesn't it make it more plausible that she was closer to Howland Island than she was to the Phoenix Island, 300 to 400 miles southeast?
For sure. She must have been really close, but she, I'm sure you could speculate that was a bit stressed when she couldn't see the ship, couldn't see the island, and which are also she said that she thought she was on them, but she couldn't see them. And when she then said, "We're taking the sun line," I assume possibly she said north and south. So she went maybe north and then didn't see it, and then maybe said, "Hey, I'm just using common sense here. If you go north and know that you don't see Howland, and there's only open water, maybe let's turn back around and try south, because at least if we can't find Howland, maybe we'll run into one of those other atolls in the Phoenix group."
So when the National Archives released this newly declassified file on Earhart, they called it the most extensive search and rescue mission in our country's history. The key point you're making, Jeff, is that's not true.
Well, it could have been very, very extensive, one of the most extensive in history, while focused on the wrong area. And that's what I would say the record supports. You can't lock in to a specific area and be that thorough, in my opinion.
What shocked me was when I was reading the files, there was a note that on July the 9th, 1937, 3 float planes from the USS Colorado conducted a brief aerial reconnaissance of Gardner, Nikumaroro Island, and the other Phoenix Islands. And the pilots actually reported signs of recent habitation. I don't know what that means. I'd be interested to know if you do. But they said there was no aircraft or survivors. They didn't land or conduct a ground search. And more importantly, the Navy's official report didn't prioritise or expand the search there, concluding they seem to be very fixed on the view that the plane must have ditched at sea near Howland Island. Was that a legitimate conclusion, do you believe?
Well, no, and what they, to go to your point, when they flew over Nikumaroro or Gardner Island at that time, the pilot did say he saw an adobe-looking hut or house, I believe it says in the logs, and then circled around and then kept going. And that's all in the logs as well.
But basically, do you think a search should have been done of Nikumaroro Island?
I mean, I 100% think a search should have been done of that island, a real search, a grid search, because if you're going by just the facts in the record, is she said she's taken the sun line. That's a line of positioning that's going to run north or south. That's if you remove everything and hold what is true across all logs and all records, is she's taken the sun line. That is just a fact. So let's just say if she takes that north, then open water, she's just going to land in water. let's say she takes it south as a possibility, even if it's a 50-50 chance, she takes it south, runs into the Phoenix Island groups, let's just say, that's a huge, huge possibility. So I would put a lot of effort and focus into that area. Now, let's just say they didn't, but they did report a lot of distress calls. They also did report flares, lights going off in that direction. So that would even be more, evidence to support the fact that, hey, maybe we should really, really thoroughly check this area, yet that still never happened.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the 157 degree, 337 degree line that was used as the primary reference, and I think very much guided the search. So I did a bit of work to try and get my brain around this because I'm not a navigator myself, and I had to sit down and try and understand this for our interview. So the reason why this transmission, where she said we're on the line 157, 337 degrees, the reason that was critical but ambiguous is as follows. It confirmed that Fred Noonan had obtained a usable sunline earlier that morning and that they were treating that 157 degree, 337 degree arc line, if you like, as their primary reference. And it showed that they believed they were close enough to Howland Island for the Itasca, the US vessel, to hear them clearly, which it did. So they were probably somewhere between 50 to 200 miles. It didn't specify whether they were north or south of the island or on which side of the line they were flying when they transmitted. Now, the official Navy interpretation is that they likely approached from the west or northwest, which is reasonable because they were coming from Lae. They missed the tiny Howland Island that was only 1.5 miles long. It was hard to spot in glare or haze, and they were now searching along that line until their fuel ran out. So therefore, for that reason, the Navy says the search was concentrated around Howland Island. But I guess the simple fact is that using the kind of navigation that Fred Noonan had back then, literally leaving Lae, you would have taken a compass bearing towards Howland Island. And the only way really that you had of knowing where you were in the sky was to do the sunline reference. If you were blown by winds, prevailing winds further south, you wouldn't know. You'd have no way of knowing where you were. You couldn't use a sextant to do celestial navigation unless the stars were visible at night when you were flying. It's quite terrifying to think of the realization that must have come across Earhart and her navigator when they realized they had no idea where they were.
Yeah, that level of stress, I could only imagine, must have been, really, really rough. And if I could, again, only imagine when you're under that level of stress, the type of, panic you would go through. You're in open ocean in the middle of nowhere. You might make some, it's quite possible, some irrational decisions, but from what we do know, as they said, we're going to take the sunline. So let's just remove everything else and know, no matter what happened, no matter how stressed or, they missed the island, we know that they were close enough to the island because they were, the Itasca was able to hear them. That's number one. And then we also know they were running low on gas. And we also know from the radio distress signals that they were going to take the sunline, right? You know those things. So therefore, I would likely search based on that line, which only happened, according to the record, to a limited degree.
So the alternative explanation, the one that I suspect you favour and in fact other groups favour as well, because there's now a proposed search soon to happen on Nikumaroro Island, is that if they were south of Howland Island on this sunline, flying southeast, that's 157 degrees, would have taken them towards Nikumaroro, approximately 350, 400 nautical miles away southeast. And that lies on very nearly an extension of that same 157337 line. So it's entirely plausible. It is essentially, this message is the single most important clue in the disappearance, because it really does deliver the final known navigational constraint. And this came after earlier messages where Amelia Earhart says, "We must be on you, but cannot see you." That came at about 7:42 a.m., so in daylight. And then she was reporting low fuel and inability to get radio direction finder bearings. And then there was an 8:43 transmission where she said she would switch to 6210 kilohertz to repeat, but nothing further was received or understood from the plane on any frequency. The Itasca continued calling without response, and Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were never seen or heard of again.
Yep. And I'll add, that's standard operating procedure of that time. If the island is not visible, procedure is to run the sun line, north or south until land is encountered.
Was the decision to focus the search around Howland Island a catastrophically bad decision by the US Navy?
In retrospect, I would say yes, because they didn't find her.
Do you believe the US Navy must have realized its mistake later on?
I mean, I don't know. I really don't know, and I haven't been able to personally find that in the logs. I mean, but a lot of the logs are copies of best copy available. So I'm not completely sure.
I mean, it's quite clear from what you're saying. How do the logs record the response to the flares, the lights that were seen to the southeast? What exactly do they say?
I could give one quote here. It says, this is in the U.S. Navy report. It says, shortly after the flares were known to be a false report was received, that further investigation of the report received on 3rd of July, that on 3105 kilohertz, a woman's voice had made 4 distress signal calls, followed by KHAQQ, followed by 225 garble off Howland, battery very weak, can't last long. Garble indicated something had been made, and considerable credence was given to the possibility of the report having been actually received.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that. What are they saying there? Are they saying they believed that that was Amelia Earhart?
According to the report, yeah.
So there was a woman's voice clearly in distress.
Garbled.
And was that detected coming from the southeast?
I'm not really sure at that time where exactly it came from, but there is records of that distress call and many others.
And what did they eventually concluded that wasn't Amelia Earhart?
Well, I don't know if they were able to conclude anything. Their at that time, their conclusion was it can't be her, because in order for it to be her, she would have to have landed, according to the engineers, and they didn't believe landed anywhere, and you couldn't make those distress calls from water.
I don't understand why they say that. Why couldn't she have made the distress calls from water? It's clearly consistent with her still being in flight.
Well, they're saying if of course you can in the air, but if you go down, and you crash into open ocean or water, that the engineers were saying that it was no way possible she can make those distress calls if she was in open ocean or landed in water, but she could if she landed on land.
Yeah. Is it possible that she was using her radio from the Howland Island?
Very possible.
Not from Howland Island, from the Nikumaroro Island?
Yeah, it's possible. Nikumaroro, at that time called Gardner Island, or another island. I mean, who knows? But I mean, that is a fact that there was distress calls. And I mean, there's a few more, not just, I could read you a few more from the logs, quotes of flares. Like shortly after the flares were known to be false, a report was received that further investigation was required. Another one, horizon seeming flares this morning. Yeah, sure.
What do you mean? What do they mean when they say the flares were known to be false? What does that mean?
Well, that's basically saying that well, one, they were saying there was a series of flares, not just one, and they're saying that it was false because they believed them to be false because they didn't believe it could be her, and it could be coming from that direction. Likely, that's what I would have to imagine.
And sorry, and to be very clear here, those flares were coming from the southeast.
Yes.
And at the time that those flares were seen, was there any plane sent towards or any ship sent towards that location?
The logs show that ships were when they saw them, turned around, went that direction, but then turned back around to go back to Helen.
On whose orders?
I imagine the Navy or from their superior, or because they didn't like I said, likely locked into the fact that they believed it was only possible that she could have went down around Helen, so it didn't make sense to put limited resources. I'm sure they're already overextended on one of the largest searches of that time, and couldn't put efforts towards the Phoenix Island group.
And so your point is, what you call your constraint analysis is that it is equally plausible that when she was flying the Sunline, she didn't go west or northwest of Howland Island. She was southeast of Howland Island on a line heading towards Nikumaroro, which is consistent with her perhaps crashing somewhere in the Phoenix Islands group.
Yeah, it's very possible that if she didn't go north on the Sunline and she did go south, knowing on a map that there is actually land that direction and not the other way, that she could have likely, ended up in that area, because that made the most sense, and possibly, went down in that area.
So are we looking at the possibility that the US Navy made a terrible mistake? It's possible that Amelia Earhart and perhaps also her navigator survived a ditching, probably just off Nikumaroro Island, and for some reason they weren't seen by the overflight plane that did one pass over Nikumaroro, and they perhaps died from starvation or thirst in the weeks following.
It's very possible. I don't think the military, I'm not claiming cover up or conspiracy or they intentionally did anything wrong. But what I am saying is the record doesn't support a thorough search, and that is very, very clear.
We have a saying in my line of work, Jeff, which is always assume a screw up before a conspiracy. We actually use language that's slightly more vulgar, but for the sake of our audience's delicate ears, because they're Americans, I won't swear. Now, there's a major expedition called the Turaya Object Expedition that's jointly organised by Purdue University, the Purdue Research Foundation, the Archaeological Legacy Institute, and it's drawing on decades of research, and it's decided to specifically target Nikumaroro to search for any evidence of Amelia Earhart or her plane. And it's focusing on investigating what's called a visual anomaly in the island's lagoon, the Turaya object that was first noted in 2020 satellite imagery. And it's visible, intriguingly and frustratingly, it's visible in 1938, a year after the disappearance, aerial photographs. And this is hypothesized to be wreckage from Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra 10E aircraft. Now, the expedition was originally scheduled for November 25. It was meant to have departed Majuro, the Marshall Islands, for a 1,200 nautical mile voyage. I've been to Majuro. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's an amazing place. It's so remote. This search was postponed to July, August 2026 due to permitting delays with the Kiribati government and the approaching cyclone season. So the 2026 effort will involve a small team spending several days on Nikumaroro Island for initial inspection, with potential follow-on phases for excavation and recovery if confirmed. The primary goals, obviously, the possible plane wreckage, but they're also going to have a look at the broader hypothesis that includes the 1940 skeletal remains. We may soon get an answer, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that expedition. And actually, I'm not sure if you're aware, more recently, there's been a second anomaly found on that island as well.
What's that?
So I believe a pilot from, I want to say maybe Australia, spotted something on Google Earth, which he believes, I think it's on the rocks or rocky area of Nikumaroro Island, that he believes could be a crashed plane, which is a different anomaly from what was found inside the lagoon in Nikumaroro. So, two different anomalies, but there's been a lot of effort and actually expeditions that have gone on in Nikumaroro.
It amazes me to hear that 88 years on, this has never been resolved definitively, even though there were flares shown in the direction of Nikumaroro, the Phoenix Islands group. Clearly, without wanting to point fingers, there seems to have been a bit of a failure here.
It's quite possible. I mean, looking back in retrospect at the logs, it does seem that it could have been, that there had to be some sort of failure because they didn't find her. And looking back, you can't have a thorough search, and not cover that area of the Phoenix Island group.
Well, if the Purdue Archaeological Institute expedition go ahead in a few months' time, it looks like we might finally be able to get a definitive answer to one of modern aviation's most intriguing mysteries. Jeff, is there anything else in your research, anything that you've uncovered in the logs, in the archives, that you think the audience needs to know about?
No, I would just say that, listen, I just wanted to point to the fact that the narrative for nearly 90 years has been one thing, which I myself believe, that's what I assume, because I heard words like thorough search, as you said, one of the largest searches in history of that time. So that's what I assumed. But then going through the logs, there's a lot of contradiction, and it does not, say that. I mean, you can't have thorough but not search one of the areas that would be a high probability, in my opinion, of where she could have went down. Those two contradict each other. And anyone could go and search these same logs, download the files from the government archives, and find the exact same quotes that I have found, and come to their own conclusion.
I guess it's refreshing that these files have finally been declassified. Was a lot of what twigged your suspicion that a search wasn't properly done, wasn't thoroughly done, in the new files that had recently been declassified?
Well, I didn't have any at the time. I had zero suspicion. I actually, didn't know a ton of the case, or I didn't have a lot of suspicions. I didn't know a ton about the case. I just knew what you learned in school, what I would read in the press and the newspapers. But it always fascinated me. So when they had the, declassified government data drop, I'm like, listen, I'm going to put it into my system. I'm going to run it and see what it flags. And it flagged contradictions that I'm bringing to your attention today. Which was, you can't have one without, the two things can't be true at the same time.
So, Jeff, you're a TV producer with quite an impressive pedigree. Any possibility you'll make a documentary about what you've discovered?
I mean, I don't know, but I think it would be interesting, and I would love to make it if someone else doesn't first.
But if the expedition to Nikumaroro does find evidence that the Lockheed Electra did crash there, this could be a vindication for your research. And I fear it raises grave questions about the adequacy of the search that was done for what was one of the world's most famous women in that era.
Yeah. I mean, it would be nice to get closure and finally find the plane. And no, it possibly wouldn't, look good.
By way of modern parallels, I can only assume that hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars were spent on the recent rescue of the WSO who parachuted to safety after he was forced to eject from his fighter plane in Iran the other week. America has a commendable record of never leaving a man or a woman behind. A lot of effort went into the Amelia Earhart search. It would be a tragedy if the poor woman died, possibly alone on a coral atoll without food or water because of an inadequate search.
Yeah, that would be a huge tragedy.
Well, Jeff, we may soon get answers. Thank you so much for joining Reality Check. I wish you good luck with your further researches, and hopefully one day we'll see a documentary from Jeff Garcia exploring the mystery of the aviatrix Amelia Earhart. Thank you very much for joining Reality Check.
Well, thank you, Ross, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.